Sometimes we just need to talk a little bit about a fine game without much of a grand story, or without several dozen other fine games being dotted around it. Sometimes we simply need to highlight a title that, no matter how old it is still pretty damn glorious. This particular game may well be over 40 years old, and it may well have been released in the earlier days of the good old ZX Spectrum, but it hasn't aged a bit. Sometimes, well, we just need to talk about a game like Splat, one of those classic bouts of specky inventiveness. A cracking idea, one that hadn't really been seen beforehand, and something that, just like other early gems like Jetpac or Chucky Egg, could have easily been a damn good arcade game with a bit more graphical zah and oomph, if you'll forgive me for using the technical terms. Splat doesn't necessarily carry the same level of fame as the best known specky gems from the early 80s, whether they be Manic Miner or the Ultimate titles, but honestly, it's as good as any of them, and it deserves to be put on the same sort of level. One of the best Spectrum games that, at least nowadays, you may not know very well. Anywho, Splat hails from 1983, and it's the first game by an outfit called Incentive Software, who were originally based in a thoroughly creaky old card shop in Reading, housed in a virtually condemned building. Incentive is a name you may well know. Again, they don't necessarily have the PR clout of an Ultimate, but then you look at the games they released and see just how successful they were, and that they were pretty influential, on the cutting edge. Nowadays, Incentive are probably most famous for the Freescape engine that powered exceptionally ambitious and popular early 3D micro titles like Driller, Total Eclipse and Castle Master. Those aren't the only hits they had. There's the Ket trilogy of text adventures, which, yes, includes the first title, Mountains of Ket, a rather amusing name with other connotations these days, a superb official conversion of Nichibutsu's Mooncrester that came about because Incentive didn't want to merely make unofficial clones of arcade games, a very idiosyncratic gem that I really enjoy called Millionaire that's also meta, a game where you try and earn your riches through running a computer game studio, and there's also the software that they created, the graphic adventure creator, and the 3D construction kit, which was the last thing they released before deciding to make a switch over to business-oriented software in the early 90s. Incentive's founder, a man named Ian Andrew, caught Uncle Clive's germs pretty early on with the ZX81, moved over to the Spectrum as soon as it was released, and first made a name for himself with a 1982 game for Quicksilver called Mind Out, the game that was a very direct inspiration for Microsoft's Minesweeper. In 2024, Minesweeper co-designer Kurt Johnson said that an unknown Macintosh clone of Mind Out provided the main inspiration for the popular Windows time killer, although in the end both titles are expansions of logical computer puzzles that date back to the 1960s. Mind Out is an early specky classic in its own right, quite like the later Minesweeper but with a bunch of extra features such as mines that chase you, damsels to rescue and what have you, and it proved to be popular. In a 2011 interview with Graham Mason for Retro Gamer, Ian said that the royalties he received from Mind Out were more than what he was making through running his stamps and picture cards shop, and so he decided to set up his own label called Incentive Software, the derelict building in Reading serving as a shopfront, an office, and also a home. You can almost picture it being a bit like something from Black Books, a chain-smoking Ian Andrew chucking books of stamps out of the way in order to make space for cassette tapes. Once the old building was at last condemned a couple of years later, Incentive moved to a much less idiosyncratic location, a business park in the village of Aldermaston, a few miles outside of Reading. And so we get to Splat. Incentive's first game came out in late 1983, cost £5.50, was originally released with a shiny holographic cover, and was coded by Ian Andrew himself, with help from his new setup's first employee, Ian Morgan, who assisted with the machine code. There is a bit of that going on here, whereas Mind Out was written entirely in BASIC. You play as a bug named Zippy, and your goal is simply to survive the maze. Unlike Mind Out, you can see the obstacles this time. However, the area in which you move in itself moves around, and you never quite know what direction it's going to move in next. If you're not careful, you can very easily get trapped and crushed by the walls. A high score is the main point of the exercise, and naturally there are things that tempt you to explore. You eat grass and plums to earn points alongside the rare bug that you grab for an extra life, and you'll get a bonus for every level that you survive in. The first level's fairly simple despite being quite lengthy at 2 minutes, but while the levels get shorter, the game gets a lot faster, the maze more complex, and the hazards more plentiful. Along with avoiding the walls, there's also water, spikes, and multicoloured walls and passages. Aside from the regular black walls, our blue bug can only touch walls or go through corridors that share his colour. Whenever you defeat a level, you'll hear a rather enthusiastic digitised yippee, like so. This sort of digitised sound effect was rather novel on the computer at the time Splat came out, the sort of thing that, at least on the specky, is probably most associated with Codemasters games, especially Oliver Twins ones. There are 7 levels in total. Once you reach the goal, the game will loop at the highest level until you eventually run out of lives. What we have here is largely a game based around risk and reward. It may appear simple, but your attention's always going to be a little diverted, taking chances in order to grab those extra blades of grass and particularly the plums. After all, the score is really the main thing here, rather than simply surviving, especially if you were playing the game when it was first released, for reasons that we'll get into. It feels in many ways like a take on Snake. There's no risk of eating yourself, but there's a lot more going on than simply grabbing food and avoiding the walls with all these different obstacles to face off against. While the actual layout of the maze doesn't change, your view does change, randomly, which helps to keep the game fresh and challenging. Even if you know the maze quite well, you're never quite sure about what direction the view is going to move in, and this makes getting close to the edge, yes style, an exceptionally risky proposition. And when the game gets speedy in the later levels, yes, it can quickly become a bit panicky. You've got that old school Pac-Man style grid movement, so you're pretty fast yourself, but when you're in tight passages it can be a bit tricky, and the moment you screw up, you're thoroughly buggered unless you can somehow escape the walls inevitably closing in, or the view changes direction, allowing you a bit of a reprieve. There is a method to the madness of the view, as it's not entirely random. Every level will start and end in a certain place, meaning that if you know how far in you are, and you know the level's layout very well, there are times when you may be able to predict where the view is going. But for the most part, anything goes in there, especially when you're in the middle of a level. It works out so well, and it manages to really nail an arcade feel. I think this would have happily fit in on the floor with better graphics and presentation. When you consider the likes of Nibbler, The Pit, and Boulder Dash, Splat would have potentially worked out pretty well as an arcade game. Of course, as far as I know, there weren't any ever plans for such a thing to happen, but I could definitely see it. As mentioned a little earlier, I cannot stress enough that if you played Splat at the time, you were very much interested in setting a high score. And why is that? Well, because this was one of, if not possibly the first Spectrum game to actually run a competition alongside its release, this being one of the common traits of Incentive Software's games, and indeed the whole reason why the company was named Incentive Software in the first place. The prize itself is no slouch either. The winner of Splat's high score competition received the grand total of £500, a bit over £2,000 in today's money. Not bad, eh? Graham Mason, in his Incentive Software write-up for Retrogamer, managed to chat to the guy who ended up winning it. A 17-year-old named James Tant was invited to Incentive's offices to prove that he had the high score, and when he played it there, he ended up with 112,930 points, winning the 500 quid and using the cash to help pay for his first car. Competitions would be a pretty regular feature of Incentive Software's titles from there on out, providing a bit more attention for their games and a good few inches in the computer's mags. But while that's a decent gimmick, it helps that the majority of Incentive's games are pretty good. They didn't release a massive amount of titles, but very few of them are duffers. Splat certainly wasn't. It got very good scores around the 80% mark at the time of its release, and was also warmly received when it was released as a budget game much later on by Alternative. Even if it was nearly 10 years old by the time the Budget Software House put it out there in 1992, it got pretty decent write-ups. The specky version of Splat is the original one, of course, but it did get released on a couple of other platforms, including a quite obscure enhanced version that we will get to in a bit. We first have a C64 version from 1984, followed by the Amstrad CPC in 1985, and then the enhanced Sam Coupe edition, which came out in 1991. The C64 version is graphically damn near identical to the specky one. Normally this would be a very bad signifier as far as ports to the C64 goes, although Splat is a simple enough title that it doesn't matter a whole lot in this instance. We do get a couple of additions. First off, your progress through each level is now represented by a bar rather than a mere percentage, and there is also a new object in this version, something that's basically a flashing mine. If you step on this, well, it might explode, or it might not. If it doesn't, you'll get some points. Other than that, it's pretty much the same with a couple of extra sound effects, and the same maze as the original. The Amstrad CPC version is a bit different graphically. I suppose that for whatever it's worth, this is the best looking of the contemporary versions of Splat, although this isn't exactly a game you play for the looks. The movement is the same here as it is on the Specky and C64. You can change the colour of the background if you want, and you've got the progress bar and the mines, as well as the spikes now being replaced by drawing pins that have the same purpose. Other than that, well, it's Splat. The only shame here is that you don't get the yippee sound. You do kind of get it on C64, but it definitely sounds better on Spectrum. Still, there's not a whole lot wrong with either the C64 or CPC versions of Splat. They were converted, respectively, by Malcolm Helen and Paul Shirley. Helen would later work on Incentive's C64 conversion of Mike Singleton's Lords of Midnight, while Paul Shirley later made a fine little puzzler called Confusion for Incentive. However, he is undoubtedly more famous for creating 1986's Spin Dizzy, originally released on Amstrad by Electric Dreams. Now, the Sam version is, as you might expect, a quite obscure affair that came out in 1991, converted by Colin Jordan, someone who's more known for text adventures, and in that regard he created the Sam Adventure system for this computer. You do certainly get a bit of a graphical upgrade for whatever that's worth, with more shapes, more colours and so on, but one of the really big additions comes in the Sonics department. We finally got some music for the game, and it's pretty good chiptunage too. The music comes from Czech programmer, musician, translator and general all things internet man František Fuka, and appropriately enough, it's a banger. Some nice pumping music to go along with the maze action. Also, even more importantly, we do actually have 3 mazes to choose from. The first maze is the original, but there are now 2 trickier mazes to try and master, complete with a few new objects, including teleports. All that and the core gameplay hasn't been messed with at all. It still plays much like the old 1983 game, and that's a good thing. And so if you do want the ideal version of this game, well, as much as the specky version is the original, this is perhaps the definitive version, and one that definitely should be played. After all, it's nice to give the Sam Coupe, the legendary micro that came far too late for success, but still has a passionate fanbase to this day, a bit of well-deserved love and attention. And with that, we are about ready to finish looking at Splat. It's another title that shows off the inventiveness you find in the old micros, especially from the early days when, well, there weren't any unofficial rules to follow, and it was a lot easier to simply have a good idea and run with it. It's held up very well as a game. I came to Splat relatively recently, only playing it for the first time a couple of years ago, and right from the off I thought it was brilliant, a true Spectrum gem, the sort of reason why I think that it is the best 8-bit micro for arcade gaming. It may not necessarily have the looks or the sound, but it's got the all-important speed and the frantic play, and when you come across the likes of a Splat or a Jetpac, Chucky Egg, Saber Wolf, 3D Death Chase, it's a transcendental sort of game, one where age and limitations simply don't matter, where the pull of the game is obvious and universal. So go ahead and get splattered today. Not only does that sound rude and insulting, but you'll most certainly enjoy it. And hopefully you've enjoyed this video too. Until the next time, bye for now.